Hello lovelies, today I'm going to talk to you about Jubensha, which is an Asian gaming phenomenon which translates to either drama book kill or script kill or murder script, roughly. Chinese is a very interesting language. People Make Games did a video on this recently, being rather breathless about it. So what is a Jubensha? Jubensha is sort of a LARP, sort of a murder mystery party, sort of a board game, sort of a role-playing game, but kind of taken to the next level in some ways in a lot of cases. And you can't really understate how much of a phenomenon this is across Asia. China, Korea, Japan, you name it, it's big. So much so that across China there are roughly 30,000 places where you can go to either buy or play Jubensha games. And you can compare that to, say, closest analogous thing currently in the States is probably escape rooms, and there's about 2,500 escape rooms across America. There are cruises, there are hotels, there are game stores devoted just to Jubensha, there are game cafes, there's the equivalent of karaoke bars where you can go and play these things, and there are even whole villages turned over to this gaming phenomenon. Now, I suggest that you do go and watch the People Play Games video because they will go into things in more depth, and they can apparently afford better production values and can afford to go and visit Singapore in a way that I can't, simply put. But unfortunately, they also wussed out on doing a live play because the game that they were looking at included themes of sexual assault, and then they went on a whole long tiresome virtue signaling rant about safety tools, and took exactly the wrong lessons from the popularity of these games in Asia. But it is interesting, something they pointed out as well. There is this huge disjunct between our reaction to murder as part of a plot or a story and our reaction to sexual assault as part of a plot or a story. You know, murder, that's interesting, that's titillating, that's fine. Sexual assault, not so much. Everyone freaks out, which is weird because when you're murdered, you're like dead forever. If you've been assaulted, you get to live. Seems the reactions are wrong, but what do I know? I'm a tool of the patriarchy, which is something that People Play Games brought up as well. They talk about changing this for the West and bringing in safety tools and blah blah blah, which again, like I say, is probably the wrong lesson to learn from the success of these things in Asia. And not all of them are about murder, and not all of them include sexual themes. As they've gotten popular and they've spread, they've become about many things. There are horror scenarios, science fiction scenarios, historical scenarios. Perhaps more worryingly, some authoritarian governments have got involved, making patriotic themes, and some companies have got involved using these as promotional tools. Though, given we've had the Wendy's TTRPG, maybe we're not in a position to be critical, but I would view both as kind of terrible harbingers of late-stage capitalism. But let's move on. I'm in a pretty good place to judge these things and to see the appeal and to maybe even create something like this. I have a lot of experience with LARP, specifically Salon LARP. I was in the Camarilla, which was the live-action roleplay society for White Wolf's games, for about 10 years, from 95 through 2005, and had run a few LARPs before that. My tabletop games got so huge that at some points I was simultaneously running a game for 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 groups in different rooms in a house. Very much like this experience, but a lot more involved as a games master. a lot of these games seem to be played around a table, kind of like an RPG, like a dinner party game, but it's all just conversation, problem solving, clue picking. And a lot of people are more into it seems, for the roleplay and the opportunity to meet people than necessarily solving the problem. So at one end it can be quite an intimate dinner party game. At the other end it can be a full-scale LARP with costuming, all the rest, often out of the same box. So why is it so popular? Why is this such a phenomenon in Asia that it's like the third most popular in-person pastime that you can find in many areas of Asia? There's theories on this. For example, post-COVID, after all the isolation that so many people had, this sort of getting together to play a game and have an experience can be a cure for alienation and isolation, and the kind of social retardation that many people have suffered. Certainly in the past, I've run games for people with learning disabilities, autism, or elsewhere on the spectrum, things like that. And the structured environment that a game provides can be a safe and useful environment because it has rules, because it follows a structure. It can be comforting and make more sense to people who have social interaction issues, and it can help them break out of their shell and become better at being social. I'm certainly an advocate for games for doing that. So maybe there's some truth in that. Also, it's a way for young men and women to meet in a structured way, again, safely, in a group, publicly, with something to do and to talk about and a shared interest, right? So that's appealing to a lot of people, especially in a lot of countries with, again, a lot of social isolation, plummeting birth rates and all the rest of it. Using these games as a way to meet potential partners seems to be appealing to a lot of them. And certainly from my Camarilla days, I can confirm that LARPs are often a bit of a meat market, with people kind of testing the waters through their character, maybe getting into some sexy roleplay in quiet hushed corners, or in their downtime sheets, which they then force you to read. It happens. So it makes sense to me that this would be a thing, a structured date where you're not necessarily playing yourself, where you can feel people out a bit and maybe meet someone. Of course, China has to ruin things by cracking down in its usual way. It can't abide anything it can't control. So there's been a bit of a crackdown on Chinese Jubensha because of violence, supernatural content, and so on. This is particularly observable in the televised game shows and things based around Jubensha. It's unfortunate, but fortunately it has spread beyond China to other places that are a bit more open. Now, this whole phenomenon started around true crime, which remains popular everywhere in other forms before spreading to other genres and other places. I find it interesting that a lot of these games have a lot of front-loaded information. You will get a booklet or two or three which you're expected to read through before the game starts. That can take anything from 15 minutes to an hour for everyone to take in the information, understand the character that they're playing, and all of that. And the game itself takes place mechanically largely through conversation. There generally aren't a lot of hard and fast rules for things. So the story gradually emerges from a mixture of character knowledge, secrets, revelations that occur during the game, and characters having different objectives. As evidence is uncovered, it might change the dynamic around the table, reveal someone's secret, or it might require different knowledge or cooperation to expose new evidence and information that changes things. And quite often there are emotional revelations as we go along. You might even find out something about your own character that you didn't know. There's a lot of unreliable narration stuff going on as well. It's a lot less freeform than tabletop role-playing games or Western LARPs. It's far more hemmed in. It's a lot more like murder mystery parties. but more involved for the players. The Games Master barely seems to have a role other than timekeeping and occasionally throwing new elements in for people to cope with. If there even is a Games Master, many of them don't seem to need or require one. Another interesting aspect, going back to the dating thing, is that most of these games are designed for exactly 6 players. 3 men, 3 women, often as couples in-game. That strikes me as a potential difficulty. Which brings me on to my final point. So, why am I not immediately jumping on this huge phenomenon and making things in this space? Why hasn't it yet taken off in the West? Well, I think people make games. Brought up one of the issues: safety tools. Whatever you feel about safety tools, they ruin immersion, and I think the Asian fans are correct when they kind of go, huh? When you talk about safety tools, and when they say things like, we can handle dark themes. You need those kind of things to surprise you or come out during the game to maintain immersion. And a lot of people in Asia seem to play these games as a kind of cathartic emotional release. Lots of people cry during the games. They're seen as very emotional, and that's why a lot of people play them. So it's counterproductive to throw about safety tools or to provide content warnings which are spoilers for what's going to happen in the game. I feel kind of vindicated that this Asian phenomenon and the people involved in it recognize that, because that's something I've been saying about safety tools for a long time. They ruin immersion, they can spoil the plot. These are big issues, and yet if you put something like this out over here that does include those kind of themes, and you don't include trigger warnings, safety tools, whatever, you'll probably end up getting excoriated for it. So there's risk, but these are often the things that most appeal to people. The titillation of murders and sexual themes and plots. It's a lot of what draws people to true crime in the first place in other media, or murder porn, as I think South Park called it. Take the latest True Detective, for example. Now, it's not a true crime story, obviously, but there are things going on that are of a sexual nature, not necessarily particularly nice, but they still help make the plot engaging and so on. There's a sort of background part, I've only seen a couple of episodes, that involves underage lesbian sex, and that being filmed. So, statutory rape and underage pornography, potentially, at least in the eyes of the law. These are things that appeal to people. These are things that get a reaction, and if the appeal of these games is getting that reaction, creating that emotional revelation and difficulty, then removing those elements or giving people an out, allowing people to disrupt the game, that's immensely counterproductive. Other issues, I think, involve, they want the player and character to have some kind of synergy, for you to play an appropriate character, one in terms of age, gender, things like that, things that will help you immerse into that character. I think that's a bit false, but it does seem to be important and integral to the appeal in Asia. Here in the West, I can see how people would find that quite limiting, and how some people would find that quite problematic if they have non-conforming gender or sexuality identities. I can see people making a fuss about not being able to play those, unless of course you made yourself a specifically queer game, in which case you're appealing to a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche recursively, which makes it probably financially, economically non-viable. Which brings us to the expense issue again. One of the big appeals of tabletop role-playing, I think, even if we buy too many books, is that at least in theory you get a great deal of value out of an RPG book. If you buy the core 5th edition sets, it's going to cost you, what, these days, 60 quid for 3 books. They're quite heavily discounted because everyone's waiting on the new edition. Earlier on, maybe 90 quid, right? And you can get theoretically infinite entertainment out of that, as well as the joy of reading the books, owning them as objects, the artwork, and so on. At least hypothetically, other games are available. So my metric for judging whether something is worth the money in terms of entertainment is how does it compare to video games, right? So back in the day, PS2, PS3 era, maybe you'd pay 30 quid-ish for a game, maybe a first-person shooter, and if you got 8 hours out of that, I felt like you got your money's worth. So that's my metric. These games are going to cost a lot to produce, a lot to ship. There's a lot of components, probably a box. So here in the UK, you're going to be paying extra in terms of VAT. Shipping's a bitch. We're probably looking at least $100, 100 quid for a box, which you're probably really only going to get to play once, unless you're very lucky. And you're going to get to play it for maybe 2 to 8 hours. Split the difference. Say 5 hours, right? Now when you split that between 6 players and a games master, it doesn't seem so expensive, but to a lot of people that's going to seem like a large upfront cost for something that you're probably only going to get to play once. So I think in a very budget conscious environment, always, but at the moment especially, it's going to be a hard sell for something that you're only going to be able to play once. That's a big issue. Also, if you're producing something nice with lots of components and mini games and so on, it's going to be very expensive to produce in an untested market. So it's going to be too expensive for indie producers such as myself to create, and big companies, especially at the moment, are very risk averse. I don't think they're likely to invest the amount of money it would take to test the waters and to do the marketing, which, even if it works, would only set up other companies in competition, because the idea of this kind of game isn't something you can copyright and keep to yourself. So there's some of the problems. Organization is another one. As was said earlier, these are normally targeted at exactly 6 players, 3 men, 3 women. Getting a regular group together of any kind is difficult. Getting a group together with the right gender mix all together in the same physical space, committed to doing something, that's even more exponentially more difficult. And if one person has to pull out for whatever reason, and people have life issues, things happen, that's that evening screwed for everybody involved. So these games are very fragile. That's something you could address with game design, have a minimum number of players and extra characters, but it's a big hurdle. So who are you selling it to then? Relatively wealthy, urban, middle-class couples with lots of friends living relatively close who can get these kind of things organised? That doesn't seem like a particularly huge market to me, though they'd be willing to pay boutique prices. Board game cafes? Maybe. There aren't that many of them yet, so that's a limited audience as well. It's hard to see how you can get this to take off without a great deal of investment, which agile indie creators can't afford and which big companies aren't going to do. And then there's all the other issues around safety, around gender, and all the rest. So while it's interesting, fascinating, something I'd love to do as a design challenge, I don't think it's particularly viable. Now there are a few Western sort of mini LARPs, scenarios and things, microscopes, Nordic LARPs that are kind of in the same space. There's Shelter in Place, for example, which is a sort of zombie survival kind of one of these things. But it would be remiss of me not to mention that some of the people involved in the production and sale of that are implicated in the recent RPG scandal. I can't escape it, even when I do a video on something else. So yeah, Olivia Hill and Philomena Young, who are implicated in that scandal, were involved in the production of that game. But that is the only one that really springs to mind of being that kind of thing that I'm aware of in the Western space. And frankly, it's not that popular despite winning an Emmy. So yeah, that's why I don't think it's particularly viable, but I would relish the design challenge. So if there's a rich sugar daddy out there somewhere, let me know. Zang. Postmortem Studios sells a wide variety of stock art, well over 500 pieces, many of them by RPG industry veteran Brad McDevitt. These are available for you to use in your personal or professional projects, whether stories or games or anything else. Check us out at rpgnow.com.